Hello, this is the revision, public law revision for the year 2020 for the topic of separation of powers. This is the second video that you will receive. So I've done some introductory remarks, some explanation remarks in the first video. So I hope you are watching this in order. So in this video, we'll go straight to looking at the questions. So for the chapter of separation of powers, unlike rule of law, that was the first chapter we did with me, for separation of powers, it is my opinion that the questions that will be coming out will be fairly predictable, right? Predictable. So what effectively they're going to be asking you is how does a separation of powers work in the UK? Is there separation of powers in the UK? Is separation of powers healthy in the UK? Does the UK adhere to the doctrine of separation of powers, right? That is pretty much what they're going to be asking you. They may ask it in a variety of ways. They may use words like, does the UK have a balance of power as opposed to separation of powers? A variety of these words can be used, but effectively what they're asking is the same thing. And what they're asking is the state of separation of powers in the UK. Is it there? Is it not there? What is your opinion on that? Right? So let's very quickly take a good example of this. And this is the 2019 question. Right, the 2019 question, we'll be looking at Zone B, I believe. You have a handout for this. You should have been sent a handout of a sample answer that I have typed out. Again, as usual, just like I've done in the earlier video as well, this sample answer is not the only answer. It is just my suggested solution, and there are a variety of ways to answer any question, right, that they can ask. So the question that we're looking at is the one that you have a handout for, is 2019 Zone B question 3, right? 2019 Zone B question 3. So we will be looking into this question in a little bit in detail, right? But then after that, we will look at some other questions as well, perhaps a little bit faster. Right, so what does the question ask, right? Discuss the extent to which the British Constitution has embraced a rigid doctrine of separation of powers. So I believe straight away there's only one real issue in this particular question, right? There's only one issue in this question, and it's the rigid doctrine of separation of powers. Has it been embraced by the UK? Now, the question is, I think, very specific. So they've asked whether the UK Constitution or the British Constitution has embraced the rigid doctrine of separation of powers. So this is not just separation of powers in general. It's very specific in that has it embraced the rigid doctrine of separation of powers. So I guess we need to get into what exactly is this rigid doctrine of separation of powers. That needs to be explained a little bit in the beginning part of your question, right? So if you look at the answer I've given you, I've given you firstly a very general introduction basically into what is separation of powers, a little bit of history, very little. Remember, you don't get too much marks from your introduction. You need to start answering the question as soon as possible. Now, introductions are necessary, right? Definitely they are necessary, because these are essay type questions and not problem based questions. So you need to have a little bit of an introduction, a conclusion later, but don't spend too much time on your introduction. I understand that introductions are safe, right? Lots of students love introductions because you can prepare it. You can have wonderful little quotations and that you've memorized from somewhere, and you put it down, right? But it is my opinion that you shouldn't be spending too much time on an introduction in an exam answer, right? So have an introduction, explain some important concepts, like here I've just explained separation of powers in general, very generally. right? And then move on to answering the actual question, what exactly the question is asking for. So after the introduction, I go straight into explaining what I think is this rigid doctrine of separation of powers, which effectively is the traditional doctrine of separation of powers, right? So I mean, although it started off, the idea of separation of powers is not new. It started off a long time ago with Aristotle and things like, and people like that. But the modern doctrine of separation of powers is widely credited to Montique, right? Baron Montique, and what did he say? He effectively, in his book, the Spirit of Laws, right? I think in French it's L'Esprit des Lois, right? The Spirit of Laws, he pretty much laid down the doctrine of separation of powers as we know it today. And I've put that down, right? Effectively, what he says is the three institutions of the state that must be separated into, must be kept separated. And so what are these three institutions of the state? The three institutions of the state will be the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, right? The legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. So I guess at this point here, it would be good for you to be able to explain in the UK, what exactly is the role of the legislature, what is the role of the executive, and what is the role of the judiciary. Who sits in the legislature, who sits in the executive, and who sits in the judiciary, right? Because the idea of separation of powers is one where it is separation not only of function but also of personnel, meaning the people who are sitting, who are members of the judiciary, if you like, or members of the executive, members of the legislature, must also be different, and there must not be any overlap in terms of the personnel, in terms of the people as well. So it goes without saying for functions, but it must also extend towards personnel. That's what the traditional doctrine says. So an absolute separation of powers, right? So you see Montique, I put down a quotation by him at the bottom of the first page, and effectively what he's saying is, you can read the quotation. I'd rather not just read it out to you, right? But effectively what he's saying is that if there is no separation of powers, it will be terrible, right? He uses the word there can be no liberty. Big words he uses, right? Again, there is no liberty if there is no separation of powers. So it kind of tells you how important the doctrine is, at least in his opinion, right? So what you need to conclude with is that the traditional doctrine of separation of powers simply says that there should be these three organs of government: the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. Explain what the judiciary does, explain what the legislature does, explain what the executive does, explain that the people, who are the people that sit in all three organs of the government, and then there must be an absolute separation of powers. That's what the doctrine says. Absolute separation of functions, absolute separation of personnel. Now, this is what the rigid doctrine of separation of powers is. Now, look, is a rigid doctrine of separation of powers the best thing? In my opinion, no. Right? And that effectively is going to be the tone of the answer. What we're going to be doing is, look, the UK, I think I'm not, there's no need for any spoiler alerts, because the UK does not have any, the UK does not have a very strict adherence to the doctrine of separation of powers. That is clear. It's been made better recently. We're going to explore all of this in our answer, right? It's been made better recently by this Constitutional Reform Act 2005, but the UK still is nowhere even close to adherence to the strict doctrine or the rigid doctrine of separation of powers as this question is suggesting. And that is effectively going to be the rest of my answer, right? So let's look at how I've gone about this, right? So I've started off with the heading, "Has the UK embraced it?" By the way, these subheadings are just something that I like to do. It's up to you whether you want to do it. You can have more, you can have less subheadings. But in a short 3 or 4 page essay, you shouldn't have too many subheadings as well, right? So I start off with the fact that the UK, as I told you, the UK does not have a clear adherence to the doctrine of separation of powers, much less the adherence to the rigid doctrine of separation of powers, right? So I straight away give you a quotation by Professor S.A.D. Smith, where he says, no writer of repute would claim that it is the central feature of the modern British Constitution, simply because there were too many overlaps between the organs of government that exist, right? The executive and the legislature and the judiciary and the executive. Too many overlaps. And when I say overlaps, what I mean there were people who sat in the executive as well as the legislature. There were people who sat in the judiciary as well as the executive. This just simply flies in the face of the doctrine of separation of powers. That was the state of separation of powers in the UK. But in 2005, there was the Constitutional Reform Act. So that's what I get into straight in the second paragraph. I don't spend too much time explaining the pre-CRA situation, because effectively that's history now, right? So let's not worry about that. What we are worried about and what we are concerned about is separation of powers today. And so it is my opinion that a good place to start would be the CRA. So I get into the CRA and I get into the 3 major reforms that the CRA 2005 has brought about. So firstly, I talk about the position of the Lord Chancellor. Now, prior to the CRA, the position of the Lord Chancellor was one of the biggest violations of separation of powers that existed in the UK Constitution. The Lord Chancellor was a senior member of the executive. He was the head of the judiciary, and he was effectively he was the Speaker of the House of Lords. These are all very important functions. These are all very powerful functions, I will add. And it is all played by this one person who was in all 3 organs of government. Sounds ridiculous. It was, at least theoretically, it was ridiculous in the face of the doctrine of separation of powers, right? Whether it worked or not, depending on who you ask, lots of people said, well, it was working fine. But as far as the doctrine of separation of powers is concerned, the position of the Lord Chancellor, it was not a very good position. Okay, what did the CRA do? The CRA today has reformed the position of the Lord Chancellor, and today the Lord Chancellor is only a member of the executive, right? The head of the judiciary now is the Lord Chief Justice, and the House of Lords appoints or elects their own speaker now. So the position of the Lord Chancellor has been made so much better. Now, what is the point of us explaining this in relation to the question? Remember, the question is asking, has the UK sort of adopted, was it the word adopted? The rigid, embraced, that's the word. Has the UK embraced the rigid doctrine of separation of powers? What we are doing is we are saying, look, they were terrible before. Today they are a lot better, but is it the rigid doctrine of separation of powers? Not likely. Not really. That's the tone of my answer. And so that's why I'm showing you. This is how the position of the Lord Chancellor was before the CRA. After the CRA, much better, but still, right? We're going to look at the other aspects of the Constitution, and you will see that there are so many areas where separation of powers still is not so clear, right? The next reform that the CRA brought about was with regard to the law lords. You guys remember who these law lords are? The law lords effectively were judges of the House of Lords. Now, there was one body called the House of Lords, right? This is another anomaly that you probably are thinking, how was this allowed for so many years, right? There was one body called the House of Lords. The House of Lords had a judicial function as well as a legislative function. So this same body of people had a legislative function. That means they were part of the legislature, they were part of Parliament, obviously, the House of Lords. Then they were also part of the judiciary. The House of Lords was also the highest appellate court in the UK, the most powerful court in the UK. And all of these were the same group of people. So your judges that were, you started off as a career judge, let's say in the High Court, and you get promoted to the Court of Appeal, and you get promoted to the House of Lords, you are now also a member of Parliament. And that was the way it was, right? Again, this is a huge slap in the face of separation of powers. This has been reformed as well today. The House of Lords has had its judicial function taken away. Right? The House of Lords has had its judicial function taken away, and the Supreme Court has been created. So today the Supreme Court is the highest appellate court in the country, and they've got no links whatsoever to the House of Lords. Another clearer separation between the judiciary and the legislature. And this is something that must be applauded. This is something that is good. So once again, we see the CRA actually bringing separation of powers in the UK to a much more clearer footing, bringing separation of powers in the UK to a much more modern, maybe closer to the rigid adherence of a rigid doctrine of separation of powers, as the question is asking, right? What is the third reform? The third reform to the that was brought about by the CRA was essentially the Independent Judicial Appointments Commission, right? The Independent Judicial Appointments Commission, their role today is to appoint judges. Prior to the CRA, the method in which judges were appointed was shrouded in secrecy and was not the best, right? There was no independence in that sense. Someone once told me it was a very nudge, wink, wink type situation. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase. It was judges were picked based on what is known as the old boys network. If you were friends, or if you went to the same university, or if you were in the same social circles as the Lord Chancellor was, then you've got a higher chance of being picked. Why? Because prior to the CRA, appointment of judges, obviously they were appointed by the Queen, but the Queen acted on the advice of the Lord Chancellor and the Prime Minister. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is both the Lord Chancellor and the Prime Minister were political positions. So you can obviously see a huge political influence in the appointment of judges. And that's not something that's good at all, right? So the CRA brought about the Independent Judicial Appointments Commission. Now the Independent Judicial Appointments Commission reports directly to the Queen, right? And through Parliament, obviously. And their role now is to make judicial appointments. So today judges, pretty much just like any other job, they apply for the job. If they, excuse me, if they feel they qualify for the job, then what they can do is they can apply for the job by writing in, and the Independent Judicial Appointments Commission will make the appointment. This keeps it free from political influence. The Prime Minister and the Lord Chancellor don't have a direct say. So once again, this is very good, right? So the CRA has brought separation of powers in the UK to much clearer footing, right? Much closer to the rigid doctrine of separation of powers that the question is talking about, right? But does that mean now that the UK is in adherence to the rigid doctrine of separation of powers? No, no. That's still quite clear. So the first major problem that I talk about, and this is the biggest problem, and I think you need to spend a little bit more time talking about this. Don't treat all the problems equally by giving them equal time in your answer. This, I think, is a far bigger problem, the overlap between the executive and the legislature. This is a significant overlap, right? Why? All of your members of government must be members of parliament, right? All of your members of government must be members of parliament, which means if you want to be prime minister, if you want to be minister, if you want to be a deputy minister, you must be a member of parliament. That's how the Westminster model works. You must be a member of parliament. This nobody will call this separation. In fact, I think the more appropriate word here would be fusion, isn't it? Right? The very antithesis of separation, this is fusion, right? This is a problem, right? A huge problem, right? Now, why? Why is this potentially a problem? This is potentially a problem because, look, if the members of government are in parliament, there is a fear that the government may dominate parliament, right? The government may dominate parliament. What do I mean by dominate parliament? Parliament is supposed to act as a check and balance against the government. The government needs parliament. Why? Because the government, in order to execute whatever policies that it may have come up with, or in order to execute whatever decisions that they need to do it via acts of parliament, right? They need parliament's approval. So if parliament were to be subservient to the executive, then that simply means that the executive has a carte blanche, isn't it? The executive will be able to do whatever the executive wants, because the government can get whatever they want through parliament. And remember, in the UK, because of the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy, this becomes so much more scarier, because parliament is supreme, remember? Right? Nobody can question an act of parliament. Right? So when we have a situation where your entire executive must come from the entire executive must come from parliament, this could give rise to a possibility of abuse, right? Now, that is true, right? That is very true. However, there are arguments as to why this is also not a bad thing, right? If you look at the second paragraph of the page that I'm looking at now, I think this is the third page, I believe, right? For example, with regard to the significant overlap between the executive and the legislature, and this is what I was talking to you about, wherein all the members of government must be members of parliament, right? This is a problem. Although this is a serious issue with separation of powers, there have been some organic check and balance mechanisms that have been developed to maintain this separation. So, a strict, rigid adherence to the doctrine of separation of powers would mean that this must be like the American-style system, perhaps, right, where the government and their legislature, which is Congress, is absolutely separate, right? Absolutely separate. If you remember when Hillary Clinton was co-opted to become a Secretary of State under President Obama's government, she was a senator, and she agreed to accept that position. She had to quit her senatorship, right? She had to resign from being a senator of the US Senate, and then only she could take up the position in government. Now that is adherence to the rigid doctrine of separation of powers, but in the UK, clearly is not. However, in the UK, in order to prevent potential abuse, what I've argued is there are some check and balance mechanisms that have already been sort of created. For example, the House of Commons Disqualification Act. If you look at the third paragraph, the House of Commons Disqualification Act ensures that the government will never overwhelm Parliament. The government will never overwhelm Parliament because it says that there can only be a maximum of 95 members of government in the House of Commons. Right? So that's one mechanism. Also, the fact that your executive sits in Parliament, some people argue, is actually a good thing, right? Is actually a good thing. Why? Two reasons. Walter Bagehot, right? Walter Bagehot has said this, and I think during the lectures we spoke about this as well. Walter Bagehot says the fact that your executive sits in Parliament is not necessarily a bad thing for two reasons. Number one, accountability, and that's something I've written down in my answer. The fact that the government will have to be accountable to Parliament via ministerial responsibility, question time, select committees. It's not a bad thing. And the only reason why they are accountable to Parliament is because they are part of Parliament. So let's say, for example, if they were not part of Parliament and they were directly elected, like the US president, or they were appointed by the US president, then in theory they are not accountable to the legislature. They're not accountable to the legislature. So in the UK Westminster style system, the fact that your executive sits in the legislature means that they must be accountable. The second reason given for why this is a good thing is because the fact that the executive sits in Parliament makes it a little bit easier for the government to run the country. Right? It makes it a little bit easier for the government to pass laws. Now, easier, I know what everybody's going to be thinking, oh wait, does that mean then it's easier to make bad laws as well? Yeah, it's true. But you got to weigh the pros against the cons, right? If we take a look at the US system of government, because they are so separate, because they are so strictly in adherence to the rigid doctrine of separation of powers, there is constantly fighting between the executive arm of government and the legislative arm of government, especially when they are controlled by different political parties. And we saw this with Obama in the last term, where Congress was already being controlled by the Republicans while he was a Democrat. And we saw this with Trump. Now, my personal opinion of Trump aside, we see that a large amount of Trump's time was taken up with this impeachment that went on. The impeachment process that went on. Unsuccessfully, of course. Arguably, they never had a chance. But because of pure politics, it went on and it took up a large amount of his time that he could have used to better govern the country, isn't it? So, how are we using this in our answer? So what we are saying is, look, is there a strict separation of powers? No. In the UK? No. What's an example of this? The example of this is the executive having to be members of Parliament. But what we are also saying then is, look, but wait, there are some check and balance mechanisms that have organically grown. There are some check and balance mechanisms that exist to prevent abuse. And also some people suggest that the fact that your executive and your legislature are fused is a good thing for the reasons that I have just told you, right? The two reasons, accountability and ease of governance. So in that sense, the UK, by looking at this one example alone, the UK definitely is not embracing rigid adherence to the doctrine of separation of powers, but it's okay. That's the thesis of my answer. It is not embracing a rigid adherence to the doctrine of separation of powers, but it's okay. It's okay, right? they've got what is known as a balance of powers, even though there is a lot of overlap, but that overlap is balanced out by all these other various ways in which they can prevent abuse, right? I've also spoken about another aspect of separation of powers, the independence of the judiciary, right? We spoke about the independence of the judiciary, right? There must be a separation between the judiciary and the executive, the judiciary and the legislature, right? So if you look at the bottom of the third page of my answer, to maintain the independence of the judiciary, right? The convention dictates that there can be no criticism of the judiciary from the executive. This is a convention that is in existence today. Also, what you can add in, in the answer is also today the Constitutional Reform Act, right? Specifically, the Constitutional Reform Act clearly says that the Lord Chancellor has a duty to maintain the independence of the judiciary, right? To make sure that the judiciary doesn't come under attack from, let's say, the executive or the legislature or anyone else, right? So this is another way in which separation of powers is sometimes maintained. Right, is sometimes maintained. But there are many other, like I said, overlaps as well. If you continue reading my answer, sorry, I just got distracted a little bit, right? In order to limit this overlap, the last paragraph I'm talking of page 3, in order to limit this overlap, the courts have developed rules of statutory interpretation that serve as a convention as to what the judges can and cannot do, right, in terms of interpreting the acts of Parliament. They have developed as a means to ensure uniformity and certainty in the law, and to ensure that judges do not legislate and stick to their constitutional role. Right? Remember, their constitutional role is purely to just interpret the law. But sometimes the members of the judiciary also go on to make law, right? This is a reality in the UK, right? Whether we like it or not, judges do make law. This is another overlap, right? The fact that judges make law is another overlap. It shows that there is no strict adherence to separation of, the rigid doctrine of separation of powers. However, right, there are inbuilt check and balance mechanisms. That's what we are saying, right? The judges themselves exercise self-regulation. We take a look at the case of Mager and St. Mellons Rural District Council versus the Newport Corporation. Lord Denning was reprimanded and accused by Lord Simmons of naked usurpation of the legislative function. So what I'm trying to say is, look, this is another aspect where there is overlapping in terms of functions, in terms of power. But the system self-corrects. That's what I'm trying to say. Right? There are check and balance mechanisms in place in order to prevent potential abuse. Because we don't want a situation where unelected judges are making law. However, the reality is it happens. But the point that we are making is that there is a kind of check and balance. There is a kind of a self-regulation that does not allow this to go too far. It does not allow the judges to take over, let's say, the role of Parliament. All right? Let's continue with the answer. So despite all that's been said before, one must still be mindful that the UK's constitutional arrangements come nowhere close to the clarity and strictness in which separation of powers is present in the constitution of some other countries, most notably the US, right? I've said this before in this video as well. The US is one of the countries, in my opinion, where the doctrine of separation of powers is most rigidly adhered to. So the answer in this question and my conclusion is it does not. There is no, let me rephrase that. The UK does not strictly embrace the rigid doctrine of separation of powers, but there are all these mechanisms mechanisms and methods in order to still prevent potential abuse. And so because of that, it's okay, right? Because of that, it's okay. Because the UK, in my opinion, has come up with, has developed sort of a balance of powers, right? Although the organs are not clearly separated and strictly separated. By the way, it's a lot better than it was before, but even then, it's still not strictly separated, but there is a balance of power. So even though there is no strict separation of powers, it's okay, because all the three organs of government kind of play a balancing act. They check on each other, they keep an eye on each other, and this, ladies and gentlemen, has proven to be very successful for the UK Constitution. Okay, so that's how I have answered this particular question, right? As usual, this is not the only way to answer, but I've put down this way in which I've suggested this way. Let's look at some other questions that could potentially come out for separation of powers. So we just looked at the 2019 question, right? So there was a question in 2018 as well, but there was no question in 2017, right? So in 2018, it was Zone A, question 1, right? Zone A, question 1. Consider whether the UK constitutional system more resembles a balance of power than a formal separation of the three branches. I read that again. Consider whether the UK's constitutional system more resembles a balance of powers than a formal separation of the three branches. So, like I said, the questions can be asked in a variety of ways, ladies and gentlemen, but I think effectively they're asking the same thing. And so you can sort of cater the answer that I've given you earlier and then tweak it a little bit to suit this particular question. So pretty much the same thing is being asked, I think, right? So you explain what is the separation of powers and explain what is the traditional, the formal separation between the three branches. Why is that important? Why is that necessary, right? Then you go on into the UK and show that in the UK, although it's a lot better today, so that's your CRA bit, right? Although it's a lot better today, there are still many aspects where there is overlap between the organs of government. Many aspects where there's overlap between the organs of government. And then you show, but despite the overlaps, right, the UK system is working fine. The biggest overlap, as usual, I would talk about is the executive and the legislature. Same thing, I'm repeating myself here. And you will say that even though there is such a huge overlap, a major overlap, but it seems to be working for the UK system because the system of government works that way, right? That overlap is seen sometimes as beneficial. Remember, we spoke about this just a bit earlier. Two reasons why it's good: accountability and ease of governance, right? And so, and the variety of other areas where there are overlaps between the organs of government as well. Every time there is a potential for abuse, every time there is a situation where there could be some kind of abuse, the system itself has developed a check and balance mechanism to correct it or to mitigate the abuse, potential abuse, right? And that's why we say that there is a balance of powers in the UK and not a separation of powers. Because I don't think, even with the CRA, even with the Constitutional Reform Act, I really don't think that anyone in the UK will be able to say that there is a clear separation of powers in the UK. But again, the point that I'm making is that's okay, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, this is what I think a separation of powers question will be about. So if you can make preparations around these themes, do a little bit of reading, please read your subject guide and read your textbooks, get more examples. I think you should be absolutely fine to answer any separation of powers questions, right? Okay, this video is ending here. Thank you very much.